Hello everybody, welcome back to Future Ed IELTS online courses. My name's Susan and tonight we're going to look at line graphs. This is our third lesson on line graphs, and we're also going to include a bar graph. So, where are my slides? So in our first couple of lessons for line graphs, we just looked at one line graph and we studied language of movement, language to talk about line graphs going up and movement going down. But it's very unlikely that we would be given just one line graph, and most of the time we would get at least two, sometimes three, or even four lines on a line graph. So how do we write about that? And tonight we're going to look a little bit more about how to compare and contrast information in our line graph. So we're going to be using our language to talk about change over time for our line graphs, and we're also going to use it to talk about a bar graph that has change over time. Not all bar graphs have change over time, as you'll see towards the end of this lesson. So let's first of all have a look at the line graphs. So for those of you who know my teaching style, I work out a very simple strategy for you to be able to tackle your writing task at the end of the day when you're tired. And I always find some questions to ask. So for our writing task 1 academic, if you get a line graph or a bar graph, you can ask yourself these questions. Question number 1, what's the topic? Question number 2, what's the tense? What tense must I use? Question number 3, what are the units? Now these I need to interpret accurately in order to get my full task response mark. And then question number 4, what are my main points? So I'm looking for an overall trend, and I'm looking for 3 to 4 details to write about, more detailed information that I can compare. And then I can ask myself, is there anything interesting? Oh, sorry. Is there anything interesting? Just ignore that word, similar there. Anything interesting that I can end my essay with? So let's have a look more at point 4. The overall trend is going to be a main trend that stands out immediately I look at the graph. And that's kind of going to be an introduction, because we don't write an actual introduction when we're writing our writing task 1 report. But we can start with an overall trend where we don't actually mention figures. And then my question 2 within my main point 4 is, what detailed information can I talk about? And we're going to have a look and say what's similar and what's different. What are the highest figures? Because, of course, those are important. My best sales, for example. So we want to contrast highest with lowest. And then we're going to be looking at what's more than or less than, comparing what's similar. And then once again, is there anything interesting that I can mention? So very much have a look at that language. What's similar, we're comparing. What's similar, we're contrasting the highest and the lowest. And we're comparing what's more than, what's less than. So we're going to be using our language of comparison. So it's a good idea to perhaps spend a little bit of time having a look at this grammar. We can touch a little bit on it here today, but it really does require a good 2-hour grammar lesson. So let's have a look at our first graph. And I just want you to spend a few minutes and think about those 5 questions and how you would analyze the data in this graph. So question number 1, what's my topic? Question number 2, what tense must I use? Question number 3, what are my units? And question number 4, what main points in terms of details can I write about? Just give you a minute or two to have a look at the graph and decide what you think is important to write about. So there are my questions. If you want to take a screenshot of that, ask yourself, what's the topic? What's the tense? What are the units? What's a general or overall trend? And then look for some details to compare and contrast, and maybe something interesting. So did you get something like this? Obviously, my topic is international and New Zealand visitors to the Rotorua Blue Baths. And my tense, I'm going to use present simple. Did somebody think you needed to use past tense? Why should I not use past tense for this graph? They don't give us a date, do they? They don't give us 2000 or 2010. And so really they're talking about January, February, March to December every year. And because this repeats, we need to use our present simple tense for routine. You may remember, if you want, refer back to your elementary grammar, the different uses for present simple. So we need to use present simple tense. What are my units? We're looking at writing in hundreds. Our figures start in hundreds and move up to thousands. So what did you decide that the overall trend was? And what did you decide to compare and contrast? I think I'll go back to the big graph to draw on that one. There it is. Okay, so let's have a look. For your overall trend, I think you could say, for example, that if you have a look at the orange line, is obviously our overseas visitors. I think we could say there were more overseas visitors to the Rotorua Blue Baths than there were New Zealand visitors. If I was looking for a second point, I could perhaps comment that perhaps the figures for the overseas visitors fluctuated far more than the New Zealand visitors. Now let's have a look at the details. Am I going to describe each line? For example, am I going to start with the number of New Zealand visitors? And am I going to write about first the figures went up and then they leveled off, and then the number of New Zealand figures went up to a peak of, and then they declined for the rest of the year? I could do that, but it's not the best interpretation, because as soon as I've got 2 line graphs, or 3 or 4, what becomes important is how we compare and contrast the information. This information would be used, for example, to know how many staff they need to have on board, or how many towels they need to have, and that sort of thing. So let's have a look. I think we could start. Our first point could be something. Oh, where's my little arrow? So the first point that I could mention is that for the first 2 months, for both New Zealand and for overseas visitors, we could say there was a steady increase. That would be my point number 1. So when you get your graph, you don't really have time to write all this out as I did in the slide I showed you earlier. That was really just to demonstrate it to you. But what I want you to do is I want you to actually just work on your line graph and draw circles and draw big numbers. So I would do this one, and I'd start with that as number 1, and that there's a similar trend for both overseas and local visitors. Okay. After that, we start moving into a difference, don't we? So I could talk about figures for overseas visitors continue to rise, and I could mention my peak, while on the other hand, figures for New Zealand visitors remain stable. So I would be comparing and I would be contrasting this information. So that would be my second point. After that, have a look at what happens now. We've got 2 very important points on the graph, and that's where our lines actually cross. And at that point, we end up with a situation where we now have more New Zealand visitors than we do overseas visitors. And so if you can have a look, you can see that here our New Zealand visitors are actually more. So that could be the third point that I mentioned, that at this point, for this period of time, we have more New Zealanders attending the warm baths. It's of course winter time, and of course it's perhaps summertime overseas, in the northern hemisphere. So, and it's of course also school holidays too for New Zealanders, isn't it? So I could mention that figures for the New Zealand visitors actually continue to rise and reach a peak of. And at this point, for this period of time, we've got more New Zealand visitors until, again, the number of visitors from abroad overtakes the number of New Zealand visitors. And so at that point, we could mention our point number 4 could be that once again, the number of New Zealand overseas visitors overtakes that of our local Kiwis. And then I could mention that for the last 3 or 4 months of the year, we have a similar downward trend. So this is one way that we can actually analyze the graph, and I've got my points all detailed, and now it's very easy for me to just simply start writing about this. So I'll just flick forward a couple of slides. And we've spoken about those points. And if you want to quickly take a screenshot of that. And then we'll move on to what language we're going to use. Okay. So now we're going to start writing our sentences. And for those of you who attended our first 2 lessons on line graphs, you may recall that we spoke about sentence structure A, where we use a structure with verb plus adverb. So let's write a few sentences now using verb plus adverb. You can have a look at this chart here. I've broken the sentence structure down for you. So there in the blue highlighted figures, right in the center, you can see my verb plus adverb. And those are the words to write about change over time or to write about movement, such as increase, substantially, decline, rapidly, go up, slowly. We'll have a look at my subject clause, and in my second lesson we spoke about how I can vary my subject clause so that I'm showing the examiner that I can use synonyms, different vocabulary, and I can write these these sentence clauses, these subject clauses with different sentence structures, different grammar structures. So that's the bones of my sentence structure: subject clause plus my verb plus how much did it change? But how did it change? And then how much did it change, which is my units, obviously. And then I can either add my time and I can add my linking word at the beginning of a sentence, or I could add my linking word and my time or my time at the end of a sentence. Okay. So let's just read through the first couple of sentences. I could write from January to March, or for example, for the first 2 months of the year. The number of both foreign and Kiwi tourists going to the Rotorua Blue Baths increased substantially from 600 to 1100 and from 200 to 600 respectively. So have a look at this little word respectively if you haven't seen it before. It's very useful, especially when I'm talking about a similar trend and I'm combining two pieces of information. So as you can see in our first instance, we're talking about foreigners and Kiwi tourists. So we're talking about both line graphs. And I've included that little word there, both, to indicate to the reader that we're going to talk about both categories. After that, so note that here I've used my linker. After that is my linker. I then describe the number of overseas visitors and have a look at how I've used here continues to rise. So here I've actually used my verb pattern. I could say the number of overseas visitors rises, but I could actually show the examiner that I could use this grammar structure continues to rise, verb plus infinitive pattern. Dramatically is a nice extreme adverb. To a peak of just over 1400 in April. So if I'm talking about a peak, I'm talking about in April. And now I'm going to contrast my information while. So now this is a word that's going to tell me that I'm going to move into talking about the opposite situation. So while the number of Kiwis going to the hot pools levels off and remains stable. So remember, that's where the graph goes straight along and there's no upward or downward movement until June. So I'm going to flick back to the large graph and I want you to practice writing some sentences about the rest of the points we discussed. Maybe I should put it on this one, then you've got the information. Okay. So practice putting some of those points in the table. now, do you? Are you able to take a screenshot of that and the graph? Did you manage to get a screenshot of the table? Shall I go back to my table? What do you think? And let's move on to the next slide and have a look through some of these sentences. Did you get some sentences like these? We started sentence number 4 then. Figures for international visitors plummet dramatically over the next months to April. And bottom out, or you could say and reach. So, and bottom out at just over 200, or we could say and reach a trough of just over 200. I moved my lines and they ended up on one line rather than two. And then we could say between May and August, more New Zealanders attended the pools than visitors from abroad, with New Zealand figures peaking at just over 800 in July. After that, as international tourist numbers grow steadily to 800 in September, the number of Kiwi swimmers continues to decline moderately. This downward trend continues for all visitors for the last 4 months of the year. So these are the kind of sentences that we're actually looking for. And my sentence structure is verb plus adverb. Of course, this little one here is slightly different. This levels off and remains. It's, that's actually not really language of movement. It's actually language to talk about something staying static. And this one here, stable, is actually an adjective, remain. What? Stable. So I didn't put it in the adverb column. So we've got a couple of little differences there, but basically there's a very simple tight sentence structure. As I mentioned, the collocation of the sentence structure is quite tight for line graphs. So we can't be hugely creative in our writing. Now we need to vary the sentence structure, because if I just write verb plus adverb, verb plus adverb, verb plus adverb, that'll possibly get me 6 or 6.5, but it's a little bit boring. We need to actually show the examiner that we can vary the way in which we construct our sentences. And a very popular sentence structure, B, is using adjective plus noun. So let's have a look. We can actually write most of those sentences, not all of them, but we can write most of them using adjective plus noun. And let's have a look at what that looks like. I didn't highlight that one. If you have a look right up here, you can see There's my adjective plus noun. And now what happens is my topic sentence ends up coming after my adjective noun rather than before my adverb, my verb plus adverb. So we can, once again, with my adjective noun, we're going to use there is, or there was, or there were, there are, there is a substantial rise, and we need to include this little word in, the number of both international and national visitors. So my information is the same. It's the same piece of information, but now what I've done is I've used a completely different sentence structure. And once again, my linker can come either at the beginning or the end, and my time can come either at the beginning or my time and linker can come up at the end. That sort of linker would be while, for example, or however. Okay. So let's just look at that sentence structure from January to March each year. There is, and that's where I'm going to change my tense, isn't it? So for this particular graph, I need to make sure that I'm saying there is a substantial rise in the number of both international and New Zealand visitors, from 600 to 1100 and from 200 to 600 respectively. Now notice what I've done. For my adjective plus noun, I've actually put my figures in brackets, haven't I? It just kind of makes it read better because there's quite a lot of information with my topic sentence and then running straight into how much, talking about my figures. But if I put them in brackets, it kind of tidies up the trouble that I could run into writing all of that together. Once again, I could say after that or then. There is a dramatic increase in the number of overseas visitors, and once again in brackets, to a first peak of 1,400 in April. While, now have a look at what's happening here, because not everything, not all the language, not all the words that I gave you to talk about language of movement work in the adjective plus noun. So while figures for Kiwis going to the blue bars level off and remain stable. So I still need to use my first sentence structure with my verb, and then of course my verb plus adjective, you could say. So that level off doesn't level off and remain stable or level off and remain constant. Those words I can't use in my adjective plus noun structure. So now if you can take a screenshot of that and go back to your screenshot of the graph, I want you to try and write some sentences using your adjective plus noun structure, and I'll give you a few minutes to do that. And I'll move on to the next slide. I don't think I've given you sentences to all of those, but if you'd like to actually email in your writing, email it into us. I'll have a look at it and I can give you some feedback on that. But now let's have a look at a bar graph with exactly the same information. My topic is the same, my time is the same, and my units on the horizontal axis are the same. So this is what we refer to as a bar graph that talks about time. So that's my horizontal axis would be would very often indicate my time. It could be 2010, 2011, 2012. And if I have a bar graph that also gives me time along my horizontal axis, well, it's really more or less the same as writing my line graph. Have a look at the two of them together. There you go. So I've still got my language of movement, and I can still certainly use that in my line graph. There we can see the same trends. So we can talk about the number of visitors for both increased. Here, when we move into bar graphs, we can also start to use other language. Like, for example, I could have a look at this point in May, and I could say in May, there were double the amount of overseas visitors than local visitors. So I can start moving into more of that comparing language, and I can use my language of movement. So bar graphs with time are very similar. However, let's have a look at some bar graphs without time. So bar graphs, they generally put information in a bar graph if we need to compare a lot of data. So although they might look quite intimidating, there's generally plenty to write about, and I don't have to write about everything. I just have to interpret the graph and write about and pull out those main ideas. Now have a look at the language that I've used here. This is a structure I've worked out over the years. And once again, my compare and contrast information. And we're looking at my main ideas. Once again, overall, what stands out? We're looking at the highest. What is the highest? Because obviously that's the most important. That's where the money lies, or it's where I need to have, get the most staff on board, or so followed by, because that's also quite important. There's a popular market that you may want to grow. And then, of course, we want to look at what is the lowest, what's the least popular. Very often, if that's a product on a supermarket shelf, they'll stop stocking it. Okay, so there are our lower figures. And then we're looking again at, is there anything similar? And if we have a look, I've done this one very obviously, just to show you that here we've got an absolute similarity between France and Germany, the same number of students enrolled from both France and Germany. Good. And anything interesting to note? We might want to note that in the case of Chinese students, no Chinese students were interested in taking the photography course. So if you can make a screenshot of this slide, I've just put together a couple of sentences to talk about that particular line graph. Now, comparative language is not always that easy to use accurately. So if you're aiming for a high level, if you're aiming for a 7.5, you need to be able to use comparative language and superlatives quite accurately. So if you have a look, just read these sentences through with you, because they're different ways to say the different ways that we can communicate these points. So I'm going to talk about A, for example. Course A was the most popular. Or the number of Chinese students was the highest, for example. So have a look here. We've got our superlative language, the most popular, and we've got the highest. Okay. Closely followed by, now sometimes the figures will be fairly close. If they're not, you could just simply say followed by B. Okay. While, or on the other hand, or however, C was the least popular, or reflected the lowest number or the lowest sales. I could also say A was more popular than B, or B was less popular than A. Of course, that word could be expensive if we're talking about prices. A was more expensive or less expensive than B. And here, of course, I'm using my more, and I'm using my comparative language, more or less. I could say, for example, course A was more popular with Asian students, while course B was more popular with the European students. So the business course was more popular with Asian students, while the photography course was more popular with European students. I'm also looking at little phrases like far more students elected to study business than. So once again, I'm looking at that far more, my adverb to describe how much more. And once again, using more than. Note how I've changed the language here. I've talked about the photography as the arts degree. So this would be one way to not to repeat photography. Have a look at the next sentence. Chinese students were the highest number of foreigners attending the university at 120, closely followed by the Koreans with 100 students. So this is quite tricky. Language of comparatives is quite tricky to actually write accurately. And what I would suggest you do is have a look at a good number of model answers. I'm planning to actually put together a complete grammar lesson on it because it's really too much to include in 40 minutes. Have a look at the last sentence. Both France and Germany had the same amount of candidates in both the business course as well as the photographic course. With twice as many students taking photography as opposed to studying business. It's for 60 and 30 students respectively for the France and Germany. So there I'm writing about the same information. Once again, both France and had the same amount. So there's some language. Or I could talk about a similar amount if the figure varies slightly. And once again, I've used this little word, both France and Germany, because I'm actually comparing them and the information is similar. Is that the same slide? Did I just copy that? I can't remember. Oh no, I think I wrote them out into full sentences as well. So there are some more sentences. Oh, they look pretty similar. Oh, right, I realize what I've done. What I've done is I've actually just extended those sentences as I would write them in the body of the report. And very quickly, as you can see, I've got myself up to 130 words, and I haven't covered everything. So it's quite easy to quite quickly get your number of words up. So I'll just give you a few moments to read through that. And if you have a look at the last sentence, it's interesting to note that this is quite a nice way, I think, to actually end your essay, because we don't write a conclusion in our report. So we're not going to conclude anything. We've analysed the data, we've interpreted the data, we've compared and contrasted the data, and then I think it's a nice way to close. It's interesting to note that no Chinese students were interested in studying photography, and that only 10 Koreans had enrolled in the more creative course. So that's a way that I like to sort of, I think it ends it quite nicely without writing a conclusion, and it doesn't necessarily leave it hanging in mid-air. I think that's about all for tonight. Yes, so that's all for now. And in the next lesson, we'll have a look at tables, and we'll do more language to compare and contrast. And we'll do more practice finding the main points to write about. And we'll probably have a look at both bar graphs and tables. Bar graphs and tables are very similar in how you handle information. Again, once again, looking for that highest followed by, and then on the other hand, or however, the lowest, and then looking for information that's similar and looking for something interesting to note. Good. So stand by, look out for that email. We'll notify you as soon as we're ready to post the next lesson. That'll be lesson 5 in our task 1 academic. Good. So what have we covered today? Let's just reflect on that. So we've had a look at how to talk about more than one line graph. We've had a look again at the questions, the 5 questions to ask. We've had a look at how we need to compare and contrast on a line graph. And we've had a look at how we need to interpret the main ideas. So we're looking at grouping information, looking for something that's similar, something that's different. And then we've had a little bit of revision of our 2 sentence structures, sentence structure A, which is my verb plus adverb, and sentence structure B, which is my adjective plus noun, so that we can vary the structure of our sentences. We've looked at including some linkers. That's going to give us more complex structures. And that's also, if you are aiming to get a 7 or 7.5, you definitely want to be linking these sentences in different ways, showing the examiners that you can write more complex structures.